it's not a form of local self-governance because you sort of risk losing control of your own affairs and you sort of remove some kind of agency from individual actors in the system. Another way of looking at this is sort of when do you need consensus for these things? And we have talked about consensus, and in the blockchain world, sort of you have this consensus problem and so on, but they don't actually force consensus about how you spend your money. And I think it's this sort of an important point in terms of understanding when we actually need consensus, and also thinking about like how we can ensure that it happens at the most local level, because not all decisions are global. That's sort of a tyranny in the extreme case. But this also ties close into what one might call the money problem, which is at the sort of most extreme. If you sort of just do exactly what you want, that's great. Except that sort of as co-contributors, as status and so on, what is sort of, if you're two people, like what sort of the payment, what are you paying for? And this sort of tenure model that we have now, it's kind of a mix between some sort of centralized, you have a boss kind of thing, but then there's also a free-for-all. But this kind of tenure model is sort of kind of untenable when it comes to sort of the structural ideas we want to have, because sort of the money has to come from somewhere, and not all sort of work is sort of equal value to the network. So what's kind of like a decentralized solution to this, sort of having the best of both worlds? Looking at sort of existing solutions, like if you look at markets, it's kind of the ultimate peer-to-peer system where you have different agents. They can be individuals or firms and so on, and you sort of pay for different services on a voluntary basis. And there's no central source of fund here. It's just sort of individuals or agents having these contracts with each other. When it comes to status, it's slightly different because the profit loss situation doesn't look quite the same. And this is kind of often seen as sort of a problem of funding of public goods. And it's a hard problem, but it's not impossible. And there are also sort of models like Kickstarter and so on, and more complex models that we can use to look at for this. And one way of looking at sort of the status, the multi-sig wallet, which was sort of the initial money that sort of lots of 20,000 people gave status to sort of fulfill the promises in the white paper, that it can act as a kind of amplifier or sort of seed funds for this type of marketplace, if you will. But who are these sort of agents in this marketplace? And that's not necessarily clear either. And this is sort of a question of scale, where you have very different dynamics on different scale levels. So you can either look at individuals, so small groups like swarms and teams, or maybe sort of medium-sized groups, which is status right now at around 100 people, and also beyond. And in terms of thinking about these systems, they all behave qualitatively different. You behave differently if it's sort of strangers, or the trust model is different if you talk to people every day versus if you've never met someone before. There's sort of overhead costs in terms of formalizing this like pieces of work and so on. And just sort of more on this sort of scale thing as it relates to decentralization. So there's some examples from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, where they sort of different sizes of things behave very differently. So city-states, they want sort of trade and commerce, and they don't have sort of resources to go to the war. But if you have an empire, you have an army, and you probably want to use it. If you have sort of a local mayor, they sort of care about sort of the fountain in a village and how it looks and these kind of pedestrian matters, but they don't care about sort of meddling in the world economy and sort of stabilize it with bailouts and so on. And there's also some interesting reading for those who are interested by Nick Szabo on social scalability, and sort of that this is something that blockchains provide for, and sort of can think about how this applies to status as well. Whenever something is big, is wrong, something is too big. And this is sort of idea that if you have bigness and size and centralization, it's very fragile to any form of uncertainty. And if you just have sort of one central policy that's sort of a mistake, that can have a huge impact. And sort of status is largely about sort of being robust and sort of anti-fragile to these uncertainties, like if things happen and things change, that sort of can adapt and survive and thrive, as opposed to sort of being wiped out by single decision. So you might also sort of the examples with the city-state and all these things like what does this have to do with status scale? We have 100 co-contributors and company structure seems completely fine. And maybe it is in some sense in that it's sort of, there's lots of tech organizations that work fine like that, but it's not really what we want long-term, and it's not the sustainable structure. And this might seem theoretical and so on, but it's actually more important now than it seems, because right now there's this kind of tension and friction, and it's sort of, it's not a good idea to have that. You want to have some kind of consistency in order to survive. And examples of this were, like practical examples this year is like the sort of the fact that we removed people leads, and then we have this sort of compensation end of the year, and we're sort of trying to solve this money problem. And yeah, it's a sort of two different models that are sort of colliding a bit, and we wanted to resolve that as soon as possible. But also sort of beyond that, beyond the sort of 100 co-contributors, we want to grow. And if you remember the last presentations, sort of the value that we create is in the network, and whether that's sort of transacting users or contributors and so on, at least on the software side, but also much more general than sort of the software. We want to sort of be this sort of open system where people can contribute. But just looking at the software side, like what would it take for us to get to 100 or 1,000 monthly active contributors and even beyond? That's some of the bigger open source projects have. And I think this requires sort of a shift in thinking towards being more like stewards and maintainers, and sort of actively trying to get people to contribute and sort of posting clear problem statements and incentivizing it and so on. And if you've listened to the last few sessions, there's definitely no shortage of work status. There's a lot of things we can do. And we also have an amazing opportunity with S&T in terms of incentivizing people to contribute to the creation of status that we're kind of wasting right now, I would say. In terms of DAO and so on, there's some just cryptoeconomic variables where you can think about it. So one is sort of privileges, and this can be like commit access or decision-making rights, various kinds, and rewards, which can be just S&T. And you might also have sort of the flip side of this that you've seen in some of the skin games examples, where you have maybe you can stake a certain amount and then lose it under certain conditions. There's ways forwards. I think there's lots of ways, but here's just three things that I think are sort of in the making now potentially. So one is sort of these sort of small bottom-up experiments that anyone can create. So you've seen around skin in the game and so on. And just a quick question: what sort of? I'm curious to sort of hear people's thoughts on sort of what's stopping people from participating in these further, and just understanding sort of what people's thoughts are. Another is sort of in terms of creating this sort of decentralized autonomous organization. I'll have a slide later which sort of outlines what one way of thinking what that is. But you can imagine sort of the corporation, the legal entity, is kind of like an agent in this, and it sort of it provides services to the DAO, and this could be for certain promises to perform certain pieces of work and so on. So maybe the LLC would be this more traditional model where you have performance management done in a certain way, and these types of things. And then also sort of going further with voting, the voting app and so on, and using it to sort of soft signal for decisions, which is like also a way of distributing this decision-making rights when we need coordination at a certain scale. So that could be when it comes to OKRs, wall of shame, how important sort of things, and potentially performance review as well. In terms of tests, like if we have sort of gone where we want to be, where we want to be, and one example is like if the company's gone, all the money from the multi-sig is gone, how do we have a structure that still operates effectively when new initiatives can get started and get funding and so on? And that's sort of what we need in order to survive long term. And another way is sort of what happens if all co-contributors who joined in 2018 or before are gone. So that includes everyone in this call. How do we have a structure where that's something like that is actually possible? In terms of sort of DAO, there's sort of lots of words thrown around and so on, and it's easy to get confused. I think that it's maybe the words are not so important, and I've seen Michael has started using the word now, networked autonomous organization, and maybe that's useful in terms of getting people getting over the fear of this sort of absurd shift to something crazy that doesn't exist. But here's one way of looking at it, which is from an old blog at the Ethereum site, where it sort of looks at if you have internal capital, so you have some sort of money in a contract or bank account, and then where the humans are at the center or if humans are at the edges. And the idea with DAOs is that there's some kind of automation at the center, which would be a smart contract, but it could also be some sort of half automation, which is maybe something like a distributed organization. And there are DAOs right now. So one example is that maybe Bitcoin can be seen as a DAO in sort of how the miners and so on operate, because there's sort of no manual intervention. But sometimes there's kind of an edge case. And here's sort of another slide in terms of decentralization, and another way of looking at it where you can look at political decentralizations. That's sort of when it comes to people. And then you can look at if it's architecturally centralized or not, and so on. So just one way of looking at it. This is just sort of for people who are interested, you can click this link. I'll provide the slides in the chat. We also have a channel called #StatusDAO if you want to talk more about this after the call. So that's it for me. Do we have anyone who is willing to moderate, or should I go? And I guess, do we have someone else who wants to speak?
I don't mind kind of kicking things off with like on my perspective. So the people ops team talk about this topic a lot. So I'd love to hear from other people as well. But I guess if I think on a base level, like we're kind of a hybrid of some of the things we do people-wise are decentralized, like how you choose your work and what you want to work on. There are no managers, but other things are very centralized. So things like, how do we decide what work needs to get done? Whether that is a bounty or whether that's like hiring a full-time person. How do we decide like who we should hire, like who can make those decisions? How do we start to pay people? All of those things are still centralized because I don't think we've come up with a good way of decentralizing them without breaking things in a serious way. It's like the example you gave around compensation and performance management are great examples. If you think about one person here who feels they should have a pay rise, doing that in a traditional way is, you come to people ops, or you go to your line manager and you ask for a pay rise, and then we do the traditional company stuff. To do that in a decentralized way is a lot more complex, and there's a lot more things to think about in terms of privacy. Just think about like who owns budgets and wallets and cash, and actually who owns decision making. And I mean, honestly, like a lot of what PeopleOps has spent in the last couple of months is probably just focusing on how we can work on decentralizing some of these things. And I would also point out, like, quite a few people have raised, actually, is it okay for some of these things to be centralized if that makes if that makes things easier to achieve our ultimate aim of decentralizing things? Maybe we'd have to be okay with having some of these processes centralized, at least for now. But yeah, curious if anyone in PeopleOps or outside of PeopleOps has an opinion. And maybe that's actually the first question this has come up. Like, how strongly do people feel about people operations and some of the people aspects of Status being decentralized versus allowing parts to be centralized to make things easier or make things simpler and help people focus on getting their work done?
I guess one way to think about it would be what's actually going to make us more competitive long term, and then you can contrast like traditional companies with decentralized organizations, and whether or not these trade-offs we're making now might be like good for productivity short term, but maybe not for scalability of the organization long term. So, for example, if you look at a traditional company now, one way you often operate is you try to find good people, and then you form some kind of hierarchy, which you hope to be based on merit or competence, and then you give small amounts of equity proportionate to the power that these individuals have. And this creates an incentive for individuals to want to see the company succeed. And then you use legal documents and paperwork to make all this happen, but the whole thing is quite cumbersome. And so the question I'd pose would be, given using Ethereum, the cost to distribute a type of ownership is radically lower? Could it be that these types of truly decentralized organizations that find ways to distribute tokens to people who are increasing the value of the value of the network, they might be much, much more competitive long term. And so we should be mindful of creating processes that have points of centralization because they might hinder our scalability. And so another question would be will the next Facebook have the same chain of command and information flow as the typical tech company has now? Or are there new ways to scale an organization that don't require this permissioned approach in the current legal system? I realize that doesn't really directly answer any of your questions.
I think if I can add to that, working on the voting DApp, I've been thinking about, two things have really come to mind. The first one is just the nuance involved in it, that some kind of governance framework, if it's set in stone, you never know if it can be gamed or if it can lead to unintended bad outcomes. And of course, the bigger the thing becomes, you run into more kind of unknowns, things that you could never expect. So I think the current approach of taking it slowly and trying to take the lowest hanging fruit, like something as simple as a signaling vote, is the right approach. And then the second thing I think about a lot is, what is the user experience benefit of a decentralized decision making? What competitive advantage does it have over your classic hierarchy? And I've come to kind of two, I don't want to call them conclusions because it's still up in the air, but kind of gut feels. Is the first one is the legitimacy of decisions, in the sense that people assume that the decision if all the information is transparent, the voting process is transparent, as well as the results is clear to everyone, it's seen as to be legitimate. And if it's been seen to be legitimate, people should, in theory, go along with it. So I think that's one competitive benefit. And then the second one is being able to get.
Sorry. What do you mean by decentralized decision making?
So something as simple as the voting DApp. And so what I mean by decentralized decision making is that the decision is made not by a central individual or even a small group of individuals, but a accumulation of.
Yeah. To me, I would make a strong contrast between something that's decentralized decision making and something like the voting DApp, because a voting DApp, essentially you coming to a collective decision. It's not, if it's decentralized, it's something that individuals can do straight away, I would say. Well, I would at least make a distinction between them, because I think they're very different. That's what I tried to touch on in the beginning in terms of agency and looking at sort of markets and not creating losers in terms of people who disagree and so on. I don't know do you distinguish between those two modes?
That's interesting. So defining decentralization in terms of partaking in a system in a permissionless manner and being able to do with what you want with it, kind of like how Ethereum works, in the sense that you can build anything you want on Ethereum. You don't have to ask the foundation's permission to do so.
Right, and I think it has to do with sort of what are you voting about. If you're voting about shared resources, then it's one thing, which is what democracy is great for, if you have some shared purse or something. And in this case, maybe that would be the multisig. But in terms of what people work on, I don't, on the individual level, it's not clear to me that that's necessarily the sort of way to go. It's a signal in terms of the entire network, but it's not the same thing as a marketplace where you have private knowledge and people having different sort of ideas about how to contribute that might conflict with each other.
I mean, right now the voting DApp is signaling, but I don't think, actually there is a pretty strong argument against it, but I don't think it's impossible that in the future voting is going to be more than just signaling, that can lead to a transfer of resources. But I think the question that you're asking is the difference between groups of people coming to a decision, and then as opposed to decentralization and the using of a network in a permissionless manner. Is my thinking correct there?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, to that end, the voting and the process of voting isn't the end all and be all of kind of decentralized governance. Just thinking off the top of my head, the other methods, JB mentioned kind of compensation. it's something that fits really nicely into that. I've spoken about maybe too much, but there's a futurarchy idea. So basically predicting when a project is going to hit a specific deadline. And if, say, the market thinks that it's really unlikely that this deadline is going to be hit, then if that deadline is hit, then it affects the compensation that people get who worked on the project. That's one other element. Another element of decentralized decision-making can be as simple as a game of dice or a rock, paper, scissors game between two people to come to a decision. I think like the scope of tools that we have available is like we're just starting to discover them. Maybe it's worthwhile actually bringing forking into the conversation.
This is an idea about decentralized governance. Maybe something we can say is about democracy, because when we have democracy in governments, the idea is that the collective group are able to make decisions. But of course, they have their systems, mostly based on representative democracy. But the goal is this: they want to decentralize the decision making. But of course, they elect a centralized actor to do that. So we could actually have something like this, but what we want, I think, is a direct democracy where we don't need to elect a representative.
Yes, so that's an interesting idea. So there's many companies out there, or organizations out there, when they look at things like compensation and how much they should pay people, instead of having that centralized within a HR or people operations team, they actually elect a group of peers and a committee, if you like, who are elected to make those decisions. And that's, that kind of feels like a halfway step to where we might be headed. But it doesn't get away from needing a central, decision function.
I mean,
so what would happen if?
Yeah, so I was just saying that, like, we've got to start small in the sense that the more and more open you make a system, like just the more and more unknowns there are going to be. Yeah, and to that point, like, let's start with the lowest hanging fruit. Like, what are the things that we can comfortably open up or decentralize? So, okay, a perfect example is the voting DApp. And a change that we made is that in order to propose something new, you have to be a controller. So your account essentially almost has to be whitelisted. And the reason for that is if the voting DApp becomes really popular and we get a lot of eyeballs on it, the incentive to then create a poll, which is either like an ICO advert, for example, becomes really, really high. So you can make a system open, and as soon as it starts scaling, like, you get all these unknown kind of consequences. So my feedback, I guess, is to keep it as simple as possible, and then to only work in the beginning in the systems that you can like tackle the problem in like small bits, as opposed to try to decentralize everything at once, or because you're going to run into these unknowns.
Yeah, and I think, Graham, one of the things we talked about was maybe one of those first steps is to decentralize some of the decision making around hiring. So if you think about how we hire new contributors, actually the first step is deciding if we have a need, like if we have a need to make a hire and commit a portion of our funds to hiring a full-time person. That feels to me like that could be a really good first step for the voting DApp. So anytime any contributor felt like we needed an extra pair of hands full-time, they would create a poll and say, I want to hire this type of person to take care of this work. Here's the reason why it would need to be a full-time position, not a bounty. And then we can have the community basically just vote on whether it's a good idea to hire that type of role. And then ultimately you could look at all of the hiring that we're doing and ask everyone to vote on the priorities of each role, which, while there would still be some centralization in terms of a recruiting team working to, bring people in, there would be a decentralization of the decision making and how that came to be.
So just a quick follow-up on that, Jamie. So in that scenario, in that particular example, do you mean that every vote, so it would be one person, one vote, regardless of what team they're a part of?
I haven't thought. I guess I haven't thought about that in detail, other than like one of the experiments we toyed with was like asking people to actually commit, funds to help hire in a kind of market prediction model. But I guess the hard piece there is education. So I, for example, personally, may not know about another team and why it's critically important that they make a hire. So you could, I guess, argue that there has to be an element of knowledge before you could vote on a certain topic.
It's like, this is where the rubber meets the road in terms of, you get to this tough governance questions in terms of like, okay, well, we're going to have a vote, but who gets the vote is like normally the first big question. And I think the hiring question is actually a really great starting point, because it's so core to the organization. But how we do it and how we approach it, I think to do it in, I guess, baby steps. So it's like, it's not, yep.
Can I question that the hiring is core to the organization? Because hiring is, to me, implies some kind of more traditional model, as opposed to sort of an open model where you put up a piece of work and you put a price on it. And that way you don't need all this knowledge in order to know the voting. It's just you have a need, and then you have some funds that can match somehow. And then if the person is useful, they end up getting more and more work in the network.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, to rephrase it, perhaps hiring to something like resource allocation.
Yeah, I would agree. Like, whether it's a freelance need, a bounty, a full-time person, an agency to do a piece of work, it all comes down to, I need something to get done. And ultimately we'll need to pay for that in some cases.
I like the idea of having I like the idea of having market mechanisms for all of the objectives that you're trying to achieve. So you could say that decentralized decisions around finance are largely a result of paying for people's time instead of their work. So one way to sort of remove hiring completely would be having the ability for people to submit proposals, and core contributors could basically accept proposals by using ETH that they've been given, and the list of certain milestones, and if you're submitting a proposal to budgets, so that would all be completely transparent, and then there'd be a market that would form around undertaking it, rather than sort of funneling people through this interview process.
Yeah.
So get a way of getting a pulse, like how do people feel about that type of setup in general, where it's not so much being paid for time, but sort of there's some value on a piece of work that might extend over a longer period of time, and having it sort of getting compensated for that piece of work instead of time per se. How do people generally feel about that, everyone?
I think it's great, but
Me too. Go ahead, Ricardo.
I think it's great, but it's kind of difficult sometimes to measure how much difficult something is to do. So we need to know some kind of feedback on maybe in that value. Maybe the value is not worth it. But I totally agree with the idea of, it seems like he's linking a voting system with status open bounty. Yeah, that would be great.
It doesn't have to be voting either. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say I have similar feedback or thoughts about that. It's just sometimes it can be difficult to break certain work into tasks or to measure certain work at all. So for different subject areas outside of engineering and design, how do you make that into work packets that you can say, okay, this person completed something that was this valuable?
Yeah, so just adding on to what Rachel and Ricardo said was, it is hard sometimes to break it down, but then in addition to that, what's the accountability and responsibility of the totality, right? So we could break it down into tasks, but what if the group of tasks that is trying to go in direction X, going in direction X is wrong entirely. So I guess I'm talking more from like a project management perspective where, you might even have broken out going in direction X completely correctly into the tasks, and those are put up for voting or for this marketplace where people volunteer and at different prices and you achieve those tasks. But who and how are people held accountable for whether going in direction X was even the right thing to do in the first place? So, I mean, I think I like the idea of people getting paid or sort of compensated for actual output that is clearly defined. That part of it, I think, is really good about this. And it also will help settle the, let's say, price of that task in a very sort of democratic way, and it will potentially long-term save us money and resources. And also will align people who are really interested in doing something to what they're doing. So I think it matches up all those incentives really well. But I think there would be practical considerations. And then the second thing that I wanted to say too was, in terms of voting with respect to hiring specifically, so to the earlier conversation, I wonder if the voting should be more on some sort of a total budget, let's say, for a team, and this is getting very operational, because once there's voting on some sort of a budget, maybe the team or the group of people then have it, at their discretion. They can use that budget however they like to accomplish their goals, right? So they can either use it to hire people or just do all the work themselves, or use, freelancers or whatever. So then it's not prescriptive in terms of voting at the level of whether we hire or not. It's voting at the level of, is that the right total budget?
I think that's a super important point. So if you think about all of resource allocation, in fact, a lot of the decentralization in people ops or in people, funding is one of the primary issues. So determining what funding goes where and what projects we're working on and how much resource we can have is actually itself relatively centralized. And I know we've started to kind of share more about the financial aspects, but yeah, totally agree that if we could be more decentralized in terms of how we allocate funds and the thinking behind that, then that would help us to decentralize the pieces below that.
One more thing about trying to, I in general, trying to work, in the past, I tried to work with this scheme with when you pay by tasks and things like that. And it's practically, it's a good idea in theory, but I haven't seen any good implementation of that ever, because you don't know the future. Your ideas how do you figure out if this task is really hard or not hard, or it turns out to be hard? How do you measure research tasks? How do you even splitting something? If you try to do this waterfall model, when you try to predict everything and you try to break everything into tasks, and then after the first week it turns out that it's something we didn't know something and we need to completely change direction. This whole thing, there is a reason that the market I'm pretty sure that a lot of people who hire developers, they would love to pay by tasks in general, but it turns out that still most of the market works on the time basis, and there is, I think, a reason, and it's not in general, but it's more about that practical implementation of that is extremely hard. But yeah, that's
So just one more thing, and then I'll let other people speak too. So one thing that this, whoever was speaking right now, I think it really resonated with me was sometimes breaking things into tasks and letting people pitch on tasks and then volunteer to do them. I think sometimes it might be less satisfying for the person who's doing the task because they cannot see the full picture and the goals of the full project and necessarily be motivated to own the project end to end, because it seems too tasky the way they're being engaged. And so that might avoid that might reduce the amount of innovation or sort of creative ideas they can themselves come up with as individuals to take things in a different direction.
Yeah, 100%. It's like when everything is broken into tasks and tasks have their own price, like I have no incentive whatsoever to think more about this project and the goals and how could I improve that. If it's not written and it's not priced, I won't do that because why should I? Right? So.
One of the things I wanted to ask about was like this consideration of quality. Does anyone have any thoughts on how like maybe we might be incentivizing sub-ideal behaviors in terms of like if you have a discrete task, is it kind of like a binary completed or not outcome? Might that task be rushed to like claim the bounty on it? Does anyone have any concerns on that?
So just in terms of the task thing, I think it's a great point. To me, this is also like, this is where it becomes a question of scale, because a task doesn't have to be a specific task that you do in a day or so. A task can also be like something that a company does or something like this, right? So you could imagine that sort of, the milestone can work on multiple levels. So you could still have some paying for time aspects, but it's more a matter of, here you have some product with some scope and there's some individual that's sort of doing this thing. And then if it's going well, then sort of they receive funding, but it could also be that funding gets removed if there's no progress, and then that individual can work on 2 other products that happen to sort of, they can be more useful in or whatever. So I don't think it has to be a task like a bounty instead of open bounty. It can be much higher level than that, and I think that's also the challenge, finding the right level, like how high up in terms of scale do you need to go for this something like this to work and be more like a market economy.
Yeah.
But also with any research tasks, you have no idea when you get any results, and you have no idea what's the progress with most of the research tasks. So this is a huge issue. And again, if we're talking about Nassim Taleb, in his first book here, or in his second book, the Black Swans, he writes about any of like research breakthroughs, and none of them were planned. Like and like you don't know, you can have zero progress for like a year, and then on the day 366 you out of a sudden get everything. So
absolutely. And that's how research is done, is they patronage. Like you can still have that model. I don't think they are incompatible necessarily. It can still be the same general framework, right? Where it can be any individual who sort of wants to see work on mesh networks, let's say. Maybe there's some early Bitcoin millionaire living somewhere and they really want to see mesh networks. And they ask like, hey, someone wants to work on this general problem. And then someone works on it and they find out some other new invention or whatever. That could totally happen, right? I don't think it's a opposition.
Yeah. It's just the devil is in the details here, because in general, it's like the paying by like projects and funding projects is a good idea. It just implementation matters a lot in here. So.
Well, that's kind of what's happening with Status, though. I mean, there's a bunch of people that funded an organism that's working to achieve an outcome. And what's happening inside that organism? Well, I bet the ones that hired it on this long term through the initial token sale don't really care.
It was the moon.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that brings up an interesting question about funding of these initiatives, is that if someone's going to fund it, is there an expectation of a return on capital? And that's how capitalism really works. And does that come into our world?
I mean, but there are 2 different types of like projects usually. Like for some projects, they are relatively safe and understandable and boring, and then you actually want a return on investment. Like imagine if you're building yet another CRM system for some company that wants that to have it like built for their own employees and things like that. So that's one type of project. Another is a venture model, when you just like spread your money and hope that one of 100 projects that you put money on returns you something, but the something might be much higher. So it depends, I think.
Yeah, I almost see like two models in terms of like, there's the research model that you mentioned, which is almost like a university giving a professor tenure or something, or grants to investigate something with no obligation. Just like, oh, hey, this is an interesting question, and your results will be valuable. Almost something similar to what like Aragon Nest has been doing with their grant program. And then you almost have like this ICO model, which is like you put in, and then you hope you're going to get a greater return out. As a method of, I think I might have gone a bit off track, but I'm just thinking in terms of what are potential decentralized funding mechanics for the future, when the initial ICO kind of cash has run out.
Is this like Giveth is, and like these kind of open market examples? How essentially you just have like these kind of no company. It's more like there's a structuring in place that just proposes ideas constantly the whole time in swarms, and then they just get funded.
But that's essentially what angel investment is about, like in a real startup world, right? So when you fund when you like you and your friends in a dorm room, you have some idea and you build something super small, like with no funding, when it doesn't require. Then you go to some guy with the money, and asking the money, and he probably gives it to you, and hopes that out of this, like a lot of people hope that he gives like a little bit of money, he gets a huge return on investment on one of the projects and totally fails on like 100 more. It's not the research per se, but
is that then that's like kind of the DAO model, right? Where we would intend to go is that if you basically remove kind of this employee structure in some cases, because the output is not the same as what you're investing in some cases. Whereas if you remove it, you could then just directly pay and streamline the process to what you need.
Yeah.
But for that, you exactly like you need to know exactly what you want to be built, right? That's one of the.
It actually, whatever the organization that's funding you thinks is valuable, right? So if you come up with a bunch of ideas, they could just be like, oh yeah, that could be valuable to us. Like it could be valuable to build a piece of hardware or investigate that. We'll fund that idea.
Yeah, so then it's very similar to venture models.
Yeah, and then the core contributors that are in that model would definitely get funded because, yeah, they're the core contributors. So it wouldn't look so good if we weren't funding their ideas, and maybe they would be undervalued, like definitely undervalued a little bit, and we would definitely fund those ideas. I don't know. I mean, I was having this conversation with Carl about this. I thought it was really interesting with those open markets. It seems like it's the future of also where companies like Google or whatever, how they would start to run things just more efficiently.
Yeah, a lot of companies, they actually split into some kind of units that compete for resources. It's not a new thing. It's been there for like a lot of years.
Yeah.
When you grew over something. But also the question is, in this model, when you have a boring and maintenance task, how would you fund them, and how would you, because if everyone is just researching and finding their ideas and things like that, there is no one left to actually support the existing thing.
You could fund it the same way, and another way would also be if you imagine sort of a traditional company being a sort of service to the DAO. You could imagine that traditional company is in sort of responsible for sort of these maintenance and sort of these sort of things that always has to be running. That would be one way of doing it. So you could still, because if it disappears, right, you would note it would lag, but you would not disappear that something. You would notice that the quality is sort of bad, and that would be valuable to have that, right, for the market.
It could also be that like that. So essentially, that company is kind of just funding that DAO, right? Like it acts as a support when it's needed and puts the money into there, that you can trust it. And then you have those contributors or anybody actually just saying, hey, we can build this, we want to build that.
I know we're like almost out of time, and I wanted to see if we could take it down a level, because it's been so I wanted to go back to something that Carl mentioned at the start, which was about decentralization of people being a positive for us in terms of giving us a competitive advantage over everyone else out there. And just for our wall of shame, are there things that people feel like we're losing a competitive edge or advantage in terms of we're centralized in many people aspects right now? What are the big issues that everyone feels like or should be on a wall of shame?
I think one big issue is that we're an open source project, but the only people contributing to the project are on our payroll in some form. So maybe that should be like a more explicit goal, is to attract other contributors.
Yeah, that reminds me. What do people think of this model where more co-contributors are more sort of stewards and maintainers in a way, at least sort of part of engineers? And like, how do you feel about that? And what do you think that it would take sort of for us to actively encourage people to submit patches and so on?
I mean,
and sort of do work.
A practical question of that example would be, who would be in control of upgrading the software or upgrading the protocol? Would that be the stewards, or would that involve some kind of, I mean, what governance mechanic do you imagine facilitating that?
No, the stewards would still be responsible, but just in terms of less focus on, there's like 10 things that we can do, I want to do them, and more about there's 10 ideas for things to do, like let's put up sort of problems for them and encourage people to work on them, and welcoming people and sort of reviewing their patches and making other people better contributors.
Would we be paying them? I think.
Yeah, we definitely could, which is why we have such a much better opportunity than something like Linux, which most people are not paid, and they still have like thousands of monthly active contributors and like a huge user land. If you look at Ubuntu, for example.
But they don't work like these Linux contributors. They don't work for free, right? There is like Red Hat that pays for Red Hat development. There is Canonical that pays Ubuntu. There is
part of them. Google, part of it. Absolutely, especially the core.
I mean, the vast majority. I wouldn't say the part like most of the people who like do this day by day, they are on payroll in different companies.
I think that the important distinction there, though, is with something like Linux or many other like piece of open source software, is that people are actively building businesses on that software. So it's in their best interest to be incredibly knowledgeable about the code base and as well contribute to that code base, because it's going to help their profit margin at the end of the day. So then in order to get people contributing to the status application and the protocol underneath it, does it not imply that we need to generate an interest or an incentive to build businesses on top of it?
Yeah, 100%. My point was not that. My point was still that we have 0 people who contribute without getting sort of any type of financial reward, but we have this opportunity to give people direct financial rewards through S&T and sort of bounty-like things. So absolutely, yeah, sure.
Yeah. So to Carl's point, I think there is a philosophical bridge that we need to make between, we are open source and let's say the whole planet and the community are contributing. But in addition to that, enabling that somehow tactically, operationally is also, in my mind, really very important for scaling, because this is the one thing that I found in my past roles is you just can't, I don't think we can scale to the level and with the speed that we want if we are relying just on core contributors.
I think this conversation kind of ties in with the chat we had yesterday about making the protocol more accessible and transforming Status, the network, into a platform of sorts. Because once it's a platform that people build on and are in some ways dependent on, then they have the incentive to actually just like Linux, they have the incentive to actually actively contribute and have good knowledge of the code base and actively contribute to, because then it's in their best interests as they use that platform and are dependent on it.
Yeah, if we look at the current open source projects that actually have a lot of like contributors outside the core group, it's either operating systems or programming languages or any kind of platform tools or any other like web servers like Apache and Nginx and things like that. So these are, I mean, because if you have some issue and you like a feature, you dislike something about your programming language, you have an incentive to go and fix it, or at least try like to fix it. But if you just have an app, for instance, I mean, what's your incentive to actually go and hack on this application? Except for being paid for it.
It depends if you look at it as an operating system for Ethereum or if you look at it as an app.
I mean
also, that.
Oh, sorry. No, I just wanted. Sorry. Go ahead, Graham.
Sorry. Okay. I just want to make the analogy. I want to see if it's true. I mean, but what the Mist wallet is to Ethereum is the status app to the status network protocol.
What is status network protocol exactly?
Basically, the series of Whisper and mail server nodes that we host.
Yeah, but again, it's only like our like only us are using this. So it's maybe it's one of the big things might be to actually prepare documentation and to have some like promotion that other people will use this except our project. Then we'll probably get something. Like we get some contributions on the, for instance, components that we like. We have Alex, the developer. He has a component about HTTP bridge, and there are some questions and contributions to this one because this is a component to React Native that people are using. So yeah, probably the first thing should be like people should be using the us.
We discussed it in the other marathon edition that we want to incentivize forking in that other clients use our protocol. So it's also part of our plans in inclusivity and openness.
Yeah, it's a recurring topic, like about a few of this, like how do we get external contributions? And, yeah.
I wanted to just comment quickly on that thought about the components and these collaborations and contributions, because I just got off a phone call with Beltran from Web3, and they're actually doing a lot of this same research. And of course, it was in their best interests to want to collaborate with us. They're looking to build the exact same kind of tool set to be able to scale across everything agnostically. And they also were fully into like asking, do you want to be involved in this? Can we be involved with what you're doing? But I see it exactly that there's a lot of the same kind of trains of thoughts happening around, scaling in terms of empowering these people. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting way forward is that when we have our thoughts also aligned, we can approach these other people that are fully up for it, because everybody seems to understand that our value is the value we put in ourselves, right? The more we can spread this, the more valuable we all become from it.
Yeah, I mean, spreading the technology is probably one of the big things that we need to focus on.
I just wanted to add there also to this topic that's about governance again. What is fair in our governance, in my opinion, especially about the allocation of the funds, is that who invested in the first place is who should vote about it. I think this would be the most fair for the governance. But we just need to find a way to make like not kill the creativity, not kill the productivity. because it should not be something all by themselves. We need a roadmap to follow and keep the creativity.
What do people think about taking like a 10-15 minutes break and then going for the decentralized computer aspect?
Yep. Sounds good.
Yep. Cool, awesome. And yeah, please check out the Wall of Shame document and fill in more, because I think there's a lot of points that were taken up here that we didn't make in the document. So yeah, see you in 15 minutes.